Hi, I'm Sarah from The Upcoming. Such a pleasure to be able to speak to you today. Maybe we could kick off with a brief introduction to this incredible documentary. What can people expect when they watch it?
So it's a documentary looking at the life and work of great filmmaker Frank Capra, and his complicated relationship with America. So his movies became emblematic of a certain kind of way of thinking about America and a certain idea of what America stood for, the American dream, this kind of thing. And his life sort of reflected that in interesting ways. But it's on the surface, it's sort of very, very simple. But as soon as you start digging, it becomes much more complicated. And the film is trying to pick this apart and pick that relationship apart.
So I know you're no stranger to sort of working on this type of thing, the work you've done on Stanley Kubrick's films, et cetera, et cetera. But what made you come to this? What was the spark of the idea? And what is it that kind of fascinates you about sort of delving into the intricacies of his filmography? That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it was those sort of contradictions in his character. I mean, the idea was first put to me by Nick Varley, who produced it. And I'd seen some Capra movies and loved them. But it was only then when Nick suggested it, I started doing some research and reading up on him, and you just like the contradictions in his life and the contradictions in his character are just so apparent that, there's a side to him that sort of seems a sort of real generous spiritedness in his films and the way he made his films, but also there's this incredible meanness that kind of comes out in his story later on. And you're kind of trying to square these things, and the politics of them, they seem so kind of progressive in many ways, but then he's this sort of lifelong Republican who actually quite anti-progressive in a lot of ways. So again, there's all these contradictions, and the last thing I wanted to do was a film where we all just say how wonderful he was and how wonderful his films were. Like that kind of film didn't really interest me, but this felt like an opportunity to do something where we could try and understand somebody who was complicated rather than simply celebrating the work, although the work definitely merits celebration in my opinion.
And I mean, it's so rich, the documentary, in terms of the different pieces that you've pulled together, obviously, archival clips from his films, the interviews, his own words that you've managed to capture. I mean, where did you even begin in sort of like finding all of that? And did you already know kind of how you were going to put it together, or did you have to see what was out there and see which interviews you could get? And then kind of, once you had all that material, think of a way you could put them together?
Yeah, it was a massive research process, basically, as you can probably imagine. And something like this, it really lives or dies on the strength of the archive that you find. And a lot of this stuff is so long ago, you really don't know what kind of luck you're going to have. Like, people weren't shooting a lot of home movies, people weren't shooting behind the scenes on films, that kind of thing. And we had some incredible luck. So Sony Pictures opened up their archives to us, and they had some incredible material. They let us kind of use the Capra movies that they own very freely, but also they had all this kind of behind the scenes on the studio lot while some of his films were being made, which was just incredible. Loads of amazing archive of the time. There was this great find as well. There was this home movie footage which had been locked in a room. I think I'm getting this story right. He donated his ranch house to Caltech, which is where he'd studied. And there was this locked room, and nobody had ever been in there, and there was no key, and blah blah blah. And one day they knocked through the door, and there was just this stack of celluloid, and it's all these home movies which we use quite extensively in the film. But you've got no idea you're going to find these kinds of things, and you're just like crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. And then you amass all this footage, and it's just about trying to a lot of work of sifting through it all and trying to figure out your story.
Did you have a favorite kind of clip, or perhaps you discovered like other films of his that you didn't even watch before, or maybe some of the moments where you do hear speaking in interviews must have felt quite like you're working through a treasure trove, and maybe some of those quotes you popped out you weren't even expecting to find?
Totally. Things from him where he's in interviews and he's talking about his own life in quite candid terms. Like, he would often do interviews where he would really spin things, and you kind of know this guy, he's famous, but and it's Hollywood, we kind of expect a bit of that. So it wasn't a huge surprise, but the great surprise was then finding things where he's not doing that, which we didn't really expect, and was a great delight. But also, you know, digging into some of his very early movies, in that kind of around the transition to sound, so his kind of late silent era films, early sound era films that he made, where there's, you know, they're rough and they're early and he's not yet Frank Capra, but you can see the charm in there and you can see all those qualities kind of beginning to emerge, and even some of the story archetypes that he became so known for. You know, he's all about the plucky little guy, right, who makes good. He's all about those kinds of stories. And you can just see glimmers of it early on, and you can see it taking shape over the kind of early years of his career. And hopefully we've captured a little bit of that in film.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, you know, always when you're sort of making these things, you know, you've got the why, like, you know, why it'd be interesting to sort of, and like you said, like seeing all those contradictions, but then there's also the why now. And it is funny sometimes when you're hearing about like the period of time, you know, it's like making films and how it's kind of reflecting, you know, how people might be feeling going through all this kind of tumultuous period. It does seem to chime a lot with today, and it's kind of raising all these questions about our relationship to cinema, and also kind of how we're saying, you know, how much do we separate someone, the artist, from the art? So, you know, if there's a film that you love, you know, does that stay the case even if you discover something about someone who's made it that you don't necessarily agree with? So it's raising all of these kind of really interesting questions that are so relevant today.
Yeah, totally. And, you know, they're films for hard times. These, you know, they were massively, massively popular during the Great Depression. And then he's making films, propaganda films during the Second World War. And after the war, he's making It's a Wonderful Life, you know, his kind of most loved movie today. And it's, you know, people were looking for some escape and some relief and some glamour and some comedy, but also some kind of reassurance that things turn out well in Capra movies. You know, they're always turbulent in Capra movies. Like the drama is pretty real. Like the stakes are quite high. It's often a lot of violence and kind of a surprising amount of violence and aggression and even self-harm, kind of planned suicide and things like this in his films. But they kind of come good. And there's something about, you know, living through difficult times as his audience was back then, and having these movies, you can see why people gravitated to them. And it's been fascinating revisiting them now, where it, you know, it feels like we're living in a very divided world, a lot of turmoil, a lot of problems. And, you know, maybe like his audience, we're also kind of turning to entertainment, but the cinema landscape has changed so much. It's sort of fascinating how it used to provide this sort of shared common ground between people, you know, bring people together, a sort of sense of unity and community, which, you know, was limited in loads of ways, and we sort of touch on that in the film. But there's something heartening in it as well, I think.
And there's a thread that sort of, you know, comes up, like interviewees were mentioning it, particularly when we think of It's a Wonderful Life. And, you know, it's like up there, like people's like #1 Christmas film. I remember going to watch it, you know, like Christmas screening. And then every time I go back to it, I'm like, gosh, it's actually pretty hard-hitting film. This is not all sort of mistletoe and Christmas lights. And people almost don't always recall that. They remember the uplifting, hopeful element, but it is quite dark and, you know, dealing with suicide. And I guess it's bringing that balance of the humor and the tragedy. And there's sometimes quite a realism in that maybe people, when they remember that film, they don't remember all that detail.
Yeah. You know, you walk away uplifted, and that's your kind of lasting impression. But to get you there in a way that's like hard won, right? I think it would be very cheesy and shallow and simple to kind of get you there without all that struggle, but it doesn't. It, you know, it takes you there. It kind of plumbs the depth before it gives you this kind of great payoff. His movies, yeah, and I think it's what makes them so good, personally.
Of course, as you were mentioning that at the beginning as well, you know, you've not shied away from the more contradictory elements of his character, and particularly in his later life, you know, some of the comments he would make. You know, did you have to find that balance? And, how did you want to kind of approach those issues? And I guess it's, providing a full picture of who he was and the stuff he made.
Yeah. It was trying to be, I wanted to do a film that would be kind of empathetic to him, but would also be completely candid about all the things that don't reflect well on him. And there's a few things, there's a number. You'd kind of expect that, I think, from a man of his era. But they're important and they matter and they're part of the story and they're part of who he was. But anything that sort of shies away from it seems to be kind of missing the point. I think if we were to focus exclusively on that stuff, you'd lose everything else. And if we were to focus exclusively on the stuff that makes him look great, I mean, that's just not who he is. So the idea was to be as kind of just to take it all on honestly and not leave anything out. That was the intention.
And to put it into today's terms, you would probably term, cancel culture is basically circling around a lot of those same issues, isn't it? The link between the art and the artist. And maybe, like in a film like this, the point is you can't have complete separation, but maybe that doesn't mean canceling someone's entire body of work either. We need a bit more nuance, and we need to be able to see people's good and bad sides, and we're all full of contradictions. So, maybe there's something to be said about that.
There's something in his movies and the way they were made that I think people often want to look at his films as a reflection of his character and his beliefs and his politics. And I can see why, because they are quite politically, they have a worldview, right? And so you immediately want to associate that with the director. But I think we look at this in the film is you really can't, because actually his worldview is reflected in his movies a bit, but so are a load of other people's worldviews, right? The writers that he was working with and so on. So these were intensely collaborative movies, and I think they kind of reflect this kind of this sort of progressive perspective and this right-wing perspective that we've touched on already. But I think that's also part of why they were popular, is that depending on your politics, you could find yourself in those movies, right? You could share Capra's politics and you'd find yourself, or you could share his writer Robert Riskin's politics, which were much more progressive, and see yourself reflected in that, see those values reflected in the movie. And so I think it's almost, whether it's deliberate or happenstance, I don't know, but it clearly worked. It clearly worked.
And what do you hope people take away from watching it? Because I guess whether you're like a complete geeky cinephile or you're not, there's so much in there to learn about his films, and almost like a bit of a history of cinema there as well, isn't there? And all the sort of politics and things that come out through it. But as we said, it does raise some of these issues and gives us a lot to reflect on in our day and age as well.
I hope we'll give people an enjoyable 90 minutes. That's the goal. It's also the kind of value of these movies to watch them now and them still be so entertaining. They still feel so fresh and entertaining. And I hope we've been able to kind of, get that across in the film and sort of let people share in that. Because they're not films that, there are diehards that watch this stuff all the time, and of course, It's a Wonderful Life, everyone watches it every Christmas. But beyond that, there's so much more. There's such richness to it, just as entertainment, but also, I say just as entertainment, I mean, entertainment is really important. And that's kind of what we're talking about in the film. It's like you need these popcorn movies and these feel-good movies. And actually they say a lot about who we are and who we've been and our history and our shared history. So the hope is also that we can kind of look at this stuff and enjoy it for what it is, but also think about it and take something from it.
Absolutely. And what does it mean to you that you'll be taking it to Venice this week?
Oh, I'm delighted. Yeah. Perfect place to be premiering it, and very glad to be going along there.
The ultimate cinephile audience, you might say.
Yeah, absolutely. Cinema heaven.
And do you know what you're going to work on next? Are you tackling another filmmaker, something different?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that are early days. We'll see. At the moment, just finishing off another film which I'm producing with Nick Varley, who also produced this film, which is about the films of Powell and Pressburger, and we're working on that with Martin Scorsese. So we're near the end of the process and shaping up to be quite a special film, I think.
Yeah, amazing. Well, can't wait to see that as well. And thank you so much for sharing that with me, and really enjoy presenting the film in Venice. I'm sure it's going to be wonderful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Nice to
Thanks
chat
for your
to
time.
you. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.